Can I pray for you, Ray? Yeah. Lord, thank you for Ray, and I thank you for the word that you've given him for us. I thank you for his gifts of teaching and his intellect, but more than that, Lord, I thank you for his heart for you that he exhibits wherever he goes and whenever he speaks. And Lord, I pray right now that you would bless the words he's prepared and bless our hearts to receive them, that it would bear good fruit, not just in the near future, but throughout the remainder of our lives and for those who do not know you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good morning, Cornerstone. Different view from up here. Seth gave a sermon in July on evangelism, and there was a potluck afterwards. And I sat with people I'd known for, a long time because it was the first potluck since the lockdown. And I asked people, how have you evangelized? And people got a little uncomfortable. They sort of shrugged their shoulders. And went, oh, well, Now this was before Mike McQueen's sermon on the levels of evangelism. It was before Dave Hanson's talk about initiating conversation. But generally, we're kind of uncomfortable talking to strangers. It's tough, they said, when we approach strangers with an agenda like evangelism. It's awkward because there's a lack of curiosity about the other person. We go into it with an agenda, and that agenda lacks the mutual give or take, the reciprocity or mutuality that you really need to have a meaningful conversation. We know how we feel when we get cold calls about automobile warranties. You try to talk before you realize it's a robot. So you just, you hang up, but you get those calls, and it's always kind of awkward to decide whether you should pick up your phone or not. Certain degree of fear and anxiety. There's an author named Joe Cohane who wrote the book, The Power of Strangers. And he writes that strangers were necessary to cultures, that no culture is entirely homogeneous, that tribes often intermingled, that kingdoms often intermingled through marriage, that strangers are a necessary part of society. He gave a story about Aboriginal tribes that was interesting because of the ceremony with which they greeted each other. Sometimes they would sit outside in a circle for 10, 15 hours. They would lay down their weapons. They would just kind of wait for the other tribe to approach them. So there's something ceremonial about how we interact with strangers. But we fear them. If you'll remember from the 1980s, the stranger danger. Remember that? But it leads to tribalism. Cohane says that the fear of strangers emanated from becoming agricultural societies. We had property to protect. And so we were a little more reluctant to engage with other people. There's the West Side Story lyric I looked up. Forget that boy and find another, one of your own kind. Stick to your own kind. And so we kind of isolate ourselves in groups of people like us. Sometimes there's just an outright avoidance. I ride my bike a lot through streets in Urbana, and I'm always trying to make eye contact with people, if only to say good morning or wave. People don't really make eye contact. Some do, and I'm always glad to initiate that, superficial greeting. But there's more than that. There's the civil inattention in public. There is the story out of Philadelphia earlier this month about a woman who was assaulted. You read about that? It was nobody intervened. They took video of it with their iPhones, but nobody intervened. She was a stranger. She was an interesting stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. There's the absent presence we have with each other. We might be in a conversation, but our iPhone's always waiting to ring. So we've got that separation and isolation from one another, what Dr. Daly last week called the internal deserts of loneliness. So we need to think about how do we get beyond that. Cohane says that there are startling and unexpected benefits when we do talk with strangers. He says research demonstrates that when we do connect with strangers, we like it, we value it, and we want to do it again. The starting point might be as simple as turning to a person sitting next to you on a bus. You're more likely than not to come away better, happier people. At least that's what the research says. But what we need to understand is that we are all strangers and aliens, as Dr. Dr. Daly said last week. We're all refugees in God's kingdom. Abraham was a stranger, so was Moses. In Deuteronomy 4:41 through 43, God provides for protection in sanctuary cities to denote God's regard for strangers. They're accommodated in Mosaic law. Amidst all of God's stringent rules about protection of property, there's this in Exodus 22:21. Do not mistreat or repress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. And then in 23:9, God repeats this for good measure. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. We know the story of Rahab from Joshua 2, who hid 2 spies because she knew the Lord had led those people out of Egypt. She protected them, and for this she was rewarded with her safety and that of her family in Joshua 6. We learn the story of the Shunammite woman to whom Elisha promises a son in 2 Kings 4, and subsequently resurrects him after an illness. For sharing what little food she had, she was rewarded with a never-ending supply of grain and olive oil. What a way to treat strangers. We all know the story of the Good Samaritan. It's the rejected stranger, much like Jesus, who saves the man's life. We know Jesus cared for sinners and outcasts, but with salvation, according to Ephesians 2:19, we are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. There's a new paradigm, a new way perhaps we can think about strangers and ourselves. There's something arbitrary about who ends up at Cornerstone. It's an incidental identification. We don't live in close neighborhoods the way people in the tribal past and frontier past did. And what we have to understand is that everybody is a minority of one. Everybody is ultimately a stranger. Cohen talks about an author, Theodore Zeldin, who wrote Feast of Strangers. He spent over 20 years trying to write a history of French culture, concluding that he couldn't do it. Everybody is just too different. He found old people. I read a couple chapters from the book. He talked about elderly people, and you can't really generalize about them. Some were pretty hopeful and optimistic about the remainder of their lives. Some were awfully pessimistic, but you couldn't make radical generalizations about them as a group. I read the chapter in education, and likewise, he found educators who wanted very traditional perpetuation of the French culture, and others who were much more innovative and humanistic about education. Again, it's too hard to draw conclusions about groups of people because everybody's different. Everybody's a minority of one, and we need to know each other more deeply than the labels that we put on each other, like old person, English teacher, which what I was, Christians. Imagine what the community sometimes thinks about that single label, or God himself, perhaps. So it reflects the Scott Peck quote from, I glitched on that, The Road Less Traveled. And what he says is, the more you look, the more you see. Earlier in the month, New York Times editorial writer David Brooks said that we resort to what's called essentialism to simplify what people are like, because there's so much information out there. It's too overwhelming. So our tendency to generalize makes a certain amount of sense, but it also cuts us off from additional information that would help us know each other better. God cannot be reduced to essentials, nor can we. We're strangers to each other, more complex than one would suspect, because we're fearfully and wonderfully made to reflect our Creator. Getting to know one another is a way of knowing each other and what we reflect of God to each other. So knowing strangers is important. Beyond this incidental identification at Cornerstone of t-shirts or hats, how do we embody the spirit of Acts 2:42 through 47 in our fragmented and far-flung culture? How do we accomplish more than that incidental identification? With reverence and awe towards each other as created by God, as God's chosen people, holy and beloved, we can increase our knowledge of the Lord by knowing each other better. Here at Cornerstone, we have to believe that God created us, that we are infinitely varied and ceaselessly interesting. Getting to know each other better will help enlighten us to the qualities of God we reflect. Am I going too fast? All right. According to study Bible author David Jeremiah's commentary on Acts 2:42 through 47, evangelism emanates from joy. Here's what he says: despite weariness, communion with others, sharing our humanity is good. It overcomes the loneliness we all have. Reciprocity, the sharing of ideas and feelings and values, is good, which is why evangelism tactics don't work sometimes. It's a lack of genuine other-centeredness. He says to think of evangelism as hospitality, as a service emanating from joy. Here's what he says, and I'll have to look down and read it. Joy overflows as evangelism. Whether corporately in the temple or within each other's homes, the believers lived with one accord and with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily with those who were being saved. Evangelism was not a program in the Jerusalem church. It was a way of life. The believers' lives and behaviors created such favor with the population of Jerusalem, the people were drawn to the Lord. Joy is meant to be experienced in the deep fellowship of a church, not only individually, but collectively. Reuben Welch says, and we really do need each other, it's not Jesus and me, it's Jesus and us. He says, the life of God in the world does not have meaning in isolated units, but in a fellowship with those who share life with him. This is the way his grace works. Evangelism emanates from the joy of fellowship. So how we experience that fellowship is paramount. Again, joy is experienced in community. Here are a couple interesting references. In 1 Chronicles 14, David now realized why the Lord had made him king and why he had made his kingdom so great. It was for a special reason, to give joy to God's people. The joy of knowing and being known like David's men in 1 Chronicles 12 goes something like this. They feasted and drank with David for 3 days. People brought food on donkeys, camels, mules, and oxen. Vast supplies of flour, fig cakes, raisin, wine, oil, cattle, and sheep were brought to the celebration, for joy had spread throughout the land. And that's, Old Testament joy. In a concordance, if you look at a concordance, you'll find about 29 entries for joy and 5 more for joyful. Let me just read a couple because they're fun. Isaiah 51:7, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Psalm 16:11, you make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with your presence. Isaiah 61:7, you will rejoice in your inheritance and everlasting joy will be yours. Isaiah 65:14, my servants will sing out of the joy of their hearts. John 15:11, I've told you this so that my joy may be complete in you and your joy may be complete. Romans 15:13, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him. And there's more, but finally, 1 John 1:4, we write this to make our joy complete. There's a lot of joy in the Bible. We miss it sometimes for the destruction of evil people in the Old Testament. But it's there, and it's certainly there in the New Testament. We need to know each other with joy before we can reach out. We need to have curiosity about shared experiences, feelings, motivations, values, and spiritual identity. We need to care about each other insofar as we can, as much as Jesus cares about us, and experience that joy. Then we can evangelize. Well, how are we going to do that? We're a small enough church that we could all know each other, unlike a mega church with a congregation of 7,000 to 10,000. What the Board of Deacons would like to set up is a commitment to 3 meetings of about an hour each for getting to know you better. Here's how it would work. We'd meet at the church, arrange seats in a circle. There'd be 4 groups. If we get about 32, 35 people to sign up, we divide into 4 groups. And we'd meet like this. First week, group 1 and 2 would meet together, and group 3 and 4. Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 7:30 in the evening. I'll leave that to the Board of Deacons to figure out. It's logistics. Second week, group 1 and 3 would meet, and groups 2 and 4. And then finally, of course, the remaining groups, 1 and 4 and 2 and 3. There's a bad finger, so I don't know if I should use it. Anyhow, format would be fairly simple. Two things. First, names. And we need ways to remember names. And as I meet people here, there's Best Beth or Marvelous Michael or Just Jonathan or Terrific Tom. There are ways you can sort of remember names. And when I had 5 classes of 30 students or more, I had to do something. And that tended to work for me. Another way to ask that question is to ask people, where were you born? Not where are you from, because that can get complicated with military families, for example, but where were you born? I'm Ray, I'm from Chicago. All right, good. But the second part would be, and again, going around, not interrupting each other, just listening, just having a heart for people's experience. One question I have come up with that Seth kind of likes is, amidst the adversity, what was something good that came out of the lockdown for you? That was a long experience, about 15 months, and we all shared the experience, but not together. Well, how can we kind of become unified about what God did in our lives that redeemed the time? Another one might be, what's a good experience you've had with a stranger? I've got a great story about a girl on a bus when I was 13, heading home, which was something I did not want to do, but she made the time tolerable. There's more to the story, but it's an example. We probably all have had good experiences with strangers. So that's the plan. And if people want to continue meeting in small groups in subsequent weeks, I'd recommend a very generalized kind of topic, which would be, what did you get out of the sermon last week? Or what did you get out of Karen's psalm? Or what did you get out of the Bible passage that was selected for the sermon? I'd recommend that we get together and listen to each other, develop a heart for each other, really know each other in a meaningful way from which joy develops and evangelism can occur. Thanks, Seth, for the time.